Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me tonight is Lamont Wood, and we're going to be talking about artifacts that that have been found over time from history that appear, at least wise appear, to have been made centuries, maybe millennia ahead of their time, that looks like something closer to our point in time than they did the actual time they were made in. And he's wrote a book about this and, what his opinions and his takes on these are. And we're going to discuss that a little bit here in just a few minutes. Lamont, how are you doing tonight?
Pretty good. As you mentioned, the book is called Out of Place in Time and Space. You can get it on Amazon or in better bookstores, for that matter. I think Barnes & Noble has it. I think even Walmart had it somewhere. So it's a collection of fairly short standalone chapters. It's good for airport reading. I think there's about 40 or 42 examples. You'd think I'd know the exact number, wouldn't you? Of things that, to satisfy the title, Out of Place in Time and Space. When I approached this, I was looking for sort of a high concept for all these examples to fit into. And I came up with the idea of the reverse anachronism. A standard anachronism is when you go to the movies, and the movie's about Rome, and the actors are speaking English. Okay, they ought to be speaking Latin, but you accept that, you don't know Latin. But that's an anachronism. That's something portrayed out of place in time. So I came up with the definition of reverse anachronism. That is where you look into the past and you see something there that really belongs in the present. And if such things exist, logic would demand that there are things in the present that are from the future that probably we don't understand and dismiss as noise or misunderstand or something. And oddly enough, I come up, and as soon as I started looking for these things, I began finding examples. And probably the most blatant one is the one I lead off with in Chapter 1, the so-called Virgin and Childless Toy Helicopter. That's a fairly conventional church painting from the late Middle Ages. It's been hanging in a museum in France now for probably centuries. And shows, like I said, the Christ child sitting in the lap of the Virgin Mary. And probably no one paid much attention to what the Christ child is depicted as doing until the last few decades, when it kind of leaps out at us, because we recognize it now as being part of our daily lives. The Christ child is depicted as playing with a pull-string flying toy helicopter. Now, that's pretty weird considering that it was painted in 1460.
And that picture is pretty clear. I saw it in your book, and it wasn't shaped exactly like a helicopter. It was like a round ball with a propeller on top, but the principle is there. Is the main thing.
It's a little toy flying machine, basically. And serious attempts by real serious scientists to build such a thing didn't begin to another 4 centuries. Yet children have been doing it apparently for who knows how long, as it turns out. And that's a theme I keep running across when I was doing research for this book, is that children's toys can often embody advanced technology, but no one pays any attention to them. They're considered frivolous no matter what. Because I also discovered that the Greeks and Romans had steam-powered toys, for instance, although they seem to have made no attempt to do serious work with them. Well, they could have scaled it up, put a kind of belt on it and turned a pump or something, but there's no record of them ever doing that. And of course, we've all heard of these toys found in Central American tombs, wheels on them, wheeled toys, from cultures that did not themselves use wheeled transport. Although that's probably because they didn't have decent roads and draft animals, so it wouldn't have been very helpful. But what are the kids doing nowadays? What should we be paying attention to? And I look around and think, does anyone really understand how bicycles work? But anyway. So it is something to think about.
Well, yeah. And when I was a kid, I had a little toy, a plastic toy, that a round propeller, kind of like the propeller on the picture you're talking about, went down on it, and when you pushed it up, it spun, and it would, when it left the stick, it would take off and fly. And it's sort of like a more, I guess you could say, modern day version of what you were describing.
Right. There's from 1460, absolutely. Now, the thing about this, presumably the artist included it in the picture for two reasons. One, to show that this is a child being portrayed, because of artistic conventions of the time, children were just scale model adults. And two, he wanted to include some kind of crucifix theme. And the four blades of the little toy helicopter makes the crucifix. But, this indicates that he assumed that people looking at it in 1460 were familiar with this and know it was a toy. I assume it basically it's a powered whirligig, really. Whirligig was just a spinning thing on a stick, and you can wave it and make it turn, or the wind will hit it and make it turn. Well, put a little English on it, apply a little, energy to it, and it'll fly by itself. You don't have to wave it in the air, and it would be entertaining small boys. But apparently no one studied this phenomenon for several hundred years.
Makes you wonder why they didn't.
Yeah, I know. Another good example of the idea of reverse anachronism would be the so-called Antikythera mechanism, because it started out as a reverse anachronism from the future when it was found 100 years ago, but now we see it something from our present. Let me explain. It was found on the seabed off the Greek island of Antikythera, hence the name, in 1901. And at the time, they dismissed it as some kind of broken clockwork mystery thing, the jumble of corroded bronze gears, basically. Nowadays, we see it for what it must have been, because it's sort of come into sync with our times. It was an ancient Roman computer, not a computer in a sense of a binary mechanism that you can program, but in the sense of the programming built into the design. It was a geared assembly, a machine for reconciling the solar and the lunar calendar. I did a bunch of other things too, but that was the main purpose. We still do that. We figure, what date Easter is going to be on by the lunar calendar. But then when you ask, when's Easter going to be, they tell you, using solar calendar, April so-and-so. So it still applies, and you might still find some use for it. But again, it started out as a reverse anachronism from the future. No one understood it. And now it's kind of slipped into the present. We see it for what it is. And you're probably waiting for me to come up with examples of reverse anachronisms from the future that are hanging around nowadays, staring at us, and we don't see them.
I think you covered some of those in the book, didn't you?
Well, I have one real candidate for that. Other than that, I'm not sure we're on solid footing, because I'm saying if we saw them, we probably would mistake them for something else.
Right.
Yeah. But
that's pretty common.
Yeah, that is common. We could be surrounded by these things. But my favorite example, my personal candidate for such a thing, would be the so-called Voynich manuscript. That is a hand-lettered, hand-illustrated book that surfaced in, I think, 1912. It's since been dated to 1420, which is, of course, before the invention of the printing press. Of course, it's hand-lettered and hand-illustrated. It's written out in handwriting by someone who appears to have been comfortable doing it. It's written with ease. In a alphabetic language. The language can be analyzed, and we can identify rules. The text can be mathematically analyzed, and we, in a way that we know it follows the patterns you expect in a language, and it's not gibberish. It's not just letter salad, word salad, whatever. The problem is this alphabet appears nowhere else on Earth. The rules of the language that they have identified as rules of no known language. And the mathematical patterns that they can pull out of it are those of no known language either. Usually you can identify, at least identify the language by the alphabet patterns. And that has gotten us nowhere, this thing. Some of the leading lights in the field of cryptography have examined it and haven't come up with any convincing decryptions. Which is really odd.
Yeah.
Then there's the illustrations, which appear to be about something until you really look at them, and then you realize they're not really about anything. there's like depictions of plants that they don't match any botanical information. There's what appears to be sketches of star fields, or that don't match anything from astronomy, or maybe they're microorganisms. They're random doodlings. We don't know. Now, there are words that appear in some parts of the book and not in others, as if they belong to the vocabulary of the subject of that chapter. And the whole thing is laid out and organized as if it's a book that you're supposed to read. But no one can prove that it actually contains any information a third party could extract. Now, it's been suggested that you could achieve a similar effect by taking gibberish and then encrypting it. The act of encrypting it would give us these rules and patterns that we see. And then when you do decrypt it, you're left with gibberish, the original gibberish. And I say that if you wanted to, pull a hoax on the CIA, that might be the way to do it. I don't think that was an issue in 1420.
Yeah, I was about to say, it sounds like they'd have to have a computer that didn't exist at the time.
I know. So the using Occam's razor, which is that the simplest explanation is the one to go with. The simplest explanation I come up with for a ordinary, everyday, prosaic answer would be that it's a artifact of someone with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Such people are known to make up their own languages and write books in it. The problem with that is that these people, when they invent their own language, usually it's really their native language, and you can analyze it and see that. And that's not been the case here. And also, whoever did it, in 1420, they must have had access to fairly unusual skills and material, and they must have had about a year to devote to it. And if you're going to be that non-functional with OCD, I don't see how that's going to happen. It would only take one person, but it just gets weirder and weirder. We're asking more and more things here from it, making more and more assumptions. Or we're back to that other thing I was talking about, that this is one of those reverse anachronisms from the future, and it is so alien to us we can't figure it out. And maybe in 500 years we will be able to. But at the moment we have no way to approach it.
It seems to me like, though, there was a time not long ago that they did have another language that was similar, that they finally figured it out after they found the Rosetta Stone. I can't remember what language it was. Could it be that there's a counterpiece to this, like the Rosetta Stone?
Oh, yeah, the Rosetta Stone, that is how they were finally able to start deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. They found a government announcement in 3 different languages, one of which was Greek, and they could read the Greek, and they could then go on throughout the hieroglyphics. Now, if we found more books in the same language, that hasn't happened. In fact, we don't even know what this language is. So, again, we've hit the wall on this one. Maybe somewhere out there is more material in this language, but it has not surfaced.
No, I can understand it would be a puzzle, especially if it was just some guy with a really intelligent mind and OCD that just created it on his own. But then you'd have to ask, for what purpose would he do that? It would just be to entertain a bored mind, maybe? Yeah,
or like I say, if you have OCD, you have compulsions you can't really control. But if that's the case, then there's the other thing about, I mentioned it's illustrated. And again, and the illustrations are like the language. They look familiar, they look like they ought to make sense, but they don't. Now, you would think that someone filling this book with illustrations would eventually sketch something real, it'd just be easier. So how come it consistently seems real but isn't? This thing is just amazing at that level. But oddly enough, that's not the most amazing thing in here, but it is my candidate for a reverse anachronism from the future. And it is, I hope, like I say, someday they can figure it out, but
it may be a while.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, I was also reading in here about the ancient computer, and that one caught my attention because I think it was something like 2 or 3 years ago. I was getting an email in one of my Yahoo groups about a news article where they talked about this very same ancient computer that was found in a shipwreck at the bottom of one of the seas. I forget which one it was. I think it was a Greek.
Yeah, the Antikythera mechanism, the one I was talking about a few minutes ago, yeah. It's off the Greek island of Antikythera, which is between Greece and Crete, really, in the Mediterranean. And,
which we know that in Crete, they had advanced water systems there, and I think other forms of advanced technology is what I've read, so it would make sense.
Yeah. Right, yeah. The Greeks were heavily into math, especially fancier geometry. They didn't have trigonometry. They made these rather complex calculations visually using geometry and basically taut string in many cases. Yes, there's no doubt they could have done this, but and obviously they did. There is the thing. There's another thing about it is that modern analysis shows it includes what they call planetary gears or epicyclic gears. If you have a car with an automatic transmission, inside the transmission case there'll be, among other things, planetary gears. And they didn't think these things existed until the Industrial Revolution. But here were the Romans using it. That was a real revelation. So they must have represented the generations of accumulated skill and knowledge in terms of making complex geared mechanisms, as well as accumulated information about the movement of the planets, because the tracking it did was quite accurate. But all that went away. All that evaporated at some point. Only in the last 150 years, probably, could we have built something like it.
Well, I know they were some pretty smart pillars back then, but here you said that a minute ago that script was not the. I want to say the terminology was most impressive technology that has been found, and I would agree with you. The one that I see in your book that I thought was perhaps the most impressive, and you may have a different opinion, would have been the death rays, Romans versus the death ray. That's the kind of thing you'd expect to see on a like a Hercules show or a Xena show or something.
Yeah, it is pretty odd, isn't it? And it requires some explanation. You'll have to stick with me here. We're talking about let me get my glasses here. They fell off for a moment. We're talking about Archimedes, whom you've probably heard of, as in the ancient Greek scientist who established mathematical formulas for various types of machinery, like simple machines, like the lever and the screw and stuff. Okay, as it turns out, he was put in charge of defense planning for the city-state of Syracuse, a rich port city on the eastern shore of Sicily at the time. And they ended up on the wrong side in the war between Rome and Carthage in about 212 B.C., and the Romans sent an army to besiege the place. And various historians, ancient historians, whose accounts have been sitting on the bookshelf for 22 centuries now, describe what happened when the Romans attacked the place. Basically, large machines defeated them, and it sounds like something out of science fiction. Especially the Romans used their navy to make a night attack on the city walls one time, and brought their ships up and put scaling ladders over the walls from the ships. And in that moment, these large machines reared up from the other side of the wall, reached over and either smashed their ships or grappled them and pulled them up so that they capsized. Like I said, it reads like something out of science fiction, and the Romans panicked and retreated. Now, the sources for that, like I say, are in fact ancient historians who are obviously relying on first-person accounts. Now, also from that same war, we have reports of the so-called death ray, although they come later. The first-person accounts I'm talking about don't mention them. Later accounts do, and they make it clear that supposedly Archimedes set up billboard-size arrays of polished metal mirrors that he used to reflect sunlight under the enemy ships and set them on fire. At least we assume that's what's going on. Now, this is Archimedes. Who knows? Maybe I don't think he invented electricity and the laser. I think this actually was sunlight he was using. But this being Archimedes, you have to wonder sometimes. Now, modern attempts to recreate this with huge mirrors and to set, wooden structures on fire have had mixed results, and you just can't, point it at something and it pops into flames. You can start charring it after a while and get some results. But, while I was researching this, I happened to be watching one evening one of these fluff news stories about celebrities. And they were talking about, I think, Jennifer Aniston having a birthday party at a resort on the southern tip of Baja California. And she's out there on the beach with her friends, and these paparazzi are bobbing out there in their boats just beyond the surf. They're an annoyance. So the management of the resort has people lined up along the shore holding large mirrors, the kind that on the back of your bathroom door, And they're lined up out there, and they're reflecting sunlight into the faces of the paparazzi out there in those boats, and that drives them away, So maybe that's what Archimedes was doing, you know what I mean? Maybe, he was getting so effective you don't have to set them on fire. That would be, a nice plus. But presumably, the defenders wanted their blockade runners to get in and out of harbor, and you would prefer to do that in daytime when it's a lot less dangerous. But of course, the enemy's watching in daytime. But you can go out there and blind them with this stuff and give your people a head start. You can drive away the enemy pickup boats and deny certain areas to them. So I think that's probably what he was doing, if anything, with these things. And people call them the death rays, and maybe they did set some ships on fire. And then Archimedes would have been happy with that, I'm sure. Like I say, this is Archimedes. Archimedes is like the mad scientist of the ancient world. He did some just amazing things.
He was a very impressive man.
Yeah, like I say. Now, those ships that he drove off the Roman Navy with, those machines he drove off the Roman Navy with, I presume that they would have looked like something like modern tower construction cranes. We have the upright pillar and then horizontal cross arm. And you can make something like that out of repurposed naval gear, masts and rigging and of various kinds. And swing the horizontal arm out and drop things from it or drop grappling hooks from it. For power, you could probably use some kind of prepositioned drop weight, which would give you some pretty good horsepower for maybe a couple of minutes before it hit ground. So that is what I envision happening anyway.
Well, I noticed you also had some material in here about the Union. I think it was remember correctly, it was a German vehicle, wasn't it? The Hunley, I mean.
Oh, the Hunley. Oh, no, yeah, that's a Confederate vehicle.
Confederate,
yes,
okay.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. That was a submarine built during the Civil War that looks like a scale model modern submarine. It has all the features you expect in a submarine. If you took some naval engineer nowadays and sent him back in time to 1863, it is what you would presume he would build, which is pretty amazing. How they could, do that is just, mind-boggling. On the other hand, you have to admit that it drowned 3 crews before it. And so, you want to call that successful? Well, you could, I guess. They did manage in the process to sink an enemy vessel. But I'm not sure it was a good trade-off. So this is an example of what I call the bleeding edge. There's the leading edge of people who are doing the latest thing. Then there's the bleeding edge of people who overextended their reach, I think, and that was the case here with the Hunley. Engineers can think along the same lines, parallel lines, centuries apart. And I think that's what's happening here. They looked at the problem carefully and solved it the same way a modern engineer would have. I don't think there's anything paranormal going on,
right.
Except it is a good idea, a good example of what can happen when people go out on a limb. Basically, they shouldn't have done it. After it sank twice and drowned the crew, the Confederate general in charge said no more, but he was talked out of it. So they made a third try, and that time did actually sink an enemy vessel and didn't come back, basically. So the third crew drowned.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't one of those crews. But, I was just sitting here thinking about it. I know that I've seen on TV that actually Leonardo da Vinci, now this isn't in your book, and I'm quite sure your book wasn't meant to be, 100% all-inclusive, although it's, got a lot in it. But yet, that he had actually invented a car.
Yeah, and well, a number of people, frankly, invented the car. I didn't include Leonardo da Vinci because he didn't actually build very much, and I stuck to people who actually managed to build stuff. And he certainly didn't build a car because you would need a high-pressure steam engine for that. Those didn't come along until about 1800 or so.
So he had basically, a blueprint for one?
Yeah, he could do a blueprint, but if he'd built one, it would have blown up on it, I guarantee. I mean, they didn't have the metallurgy to do that. They started building steam engines really in about 1710 or 1712, and the engineering of the steam engine and the engineering of producing the necessary metallurgy kind of went hand in hand for the next century. And eventually they got to the point where they could build a locomotive and a steam engine, mobile steam engines, small high-pressure ones. Because they started out with just big low-pressure monsters, basically, that were stationary and were used to pump water out of mines. We're okay for that, but you couldn't go anywhere with them. Had the size of a small room, really.
It's still, though, I think, is a testament to the intellect of our forefathers that a lot of people haven't studied history enough to really be aware that, yes, there were people in the past that had such vivid imagination, such vision, that they actually had plans for these type of things if they didn't actually invent them, that are things that were, well ahead of their time, in other words.
Oh, yeah. Many of our ancestors were no slouches. There were quite a few genuine geniuses back then, including, like I say, Archimedes, who did some amazing things. But it goes beyond that. I mean, I see these people who think that, that the ancients couldn't have built the pyramids without, extraterrestrials helping them or something. I mean, you're just piling up rocks. What's the big deal, And I have on my shelf a copy of the U.S. Army 1862 Ordnance Manual, and it tells how to lift and mount coast artillery pieces that can weigh 20 tons, in an emergency using only levers and big pieces of wood. You raise one side a few inches, you slip with a big lever, you slip something under it, you go to the other side. You do this 20 times, and after a while it's up in the air, I'm sure the Egyptians were doing something like that. You don't need heavy equipment. You just need a lot of elbow grease sometimes, and a little coordination, and long pieces of wood, etc.
I don't know if I can agree on that one. I mean,
okay.
Well, here
yeah.
Well,
I
no,
can't say they weren't there ever.
What I'm looking at, though, is the fact that they quarried these things from like 100 miles away, is what I've read, and that supposedly, and pardon me, I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but I've read that according to Zawi Howes, in order for them to have built the pyramid, it took 20 years. Right. And they would have had to had a huge work crew, and they would have had to put at least one block in less than a minute or every minute for that whole 20 years nonstop to get it built. I
think it's more like one every 10 minutes. But as I understand it, that was the whole point. It was a make-work project. 20,000 men working for 20 years. Apparently it sounded great at the time. They only needed them. Most of the work went on during the season that the Nile was flooded, and then they could bring barges right up to the Giza Plateau. You're saying that they're 100 miles away. They were, but that's along the side of the river too. So you put it on a barge, you move it down there, and you're pretty much done. And then you just drag up the ramp to the top of the pyramid. And as the thing gets taller, guess what? You need fewer blocks. It's pointy. So. Everything it's saying is true, but that doesn't mean they couldn't do it.
Well, I know that Christopher Dunn, I believe it is, put forth the water plant theory for the building of the pyramid, in fact.
Yeah.
And I wasn't there to say, and I know that right now most anything about how they were built is theoretical, and everybody has a theory on it. But you have to admit, no matter how it was done, it's still a very impressive monument. The only thing it's to me, it defies logic for them to want to build such a monument without some kind of a huge reason, because human nature usually wants to go with the easy way versus building something that's that complex, in other words.
Well, apparently the ego of the pharaoh was up to the task. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the downtown Manhattan. There's no real reason to have these tall buildings there with people's names on them. I mean, the guy who built the Chrysler Building put his name on it. Why? He could have moved out to the suburbs, but he did that. Obviously, there's ego involvement, and he had the money, and he did it. I mean, why did we go to the moon? Largely ego, I think. It's an old story, basically. Yes, apparently they had a reason good enough for them to do it.
Well, then too, I don't think I'll ever understand the human psyche very well anyway, but I got to tell you, whatever the reason, there's been a lot of things that have been done that are just mind-boggling, like you were saying, but yet they were done nonetheless. I noticed you also spoke about Prince Hal's modern surgery in here, and that was an interesting story. The only thing about that kind of story there is it kind of, I guess in a sense, gives me the willies when I think about the pain that you had to experience the surgery.
Yeah, and like I said in the article, the original account does not mention any use of painkillers, but I really hope there was some painkillers involved, because it makes your flesh crawl. So let me explain. We're talking about the future Prince Henry V, who, when he was a teenager, was hit by an arrow in battle, and I think it was 1403. Yeah, 1403, when he was 16 years old. And war arrows at that time had heavy arrow heads that were attached to the shaft only by a little piece of wax or something, so that the shaft would come off and leave the arrowhead stuck in your flesh, basically, where it would cause an infection and kill you. Nasty thing. And he was hit in the face below the eye, level with the nose, basically on the left side, and it lodged in there pretty deep. Had it gone any deeper, it probably hit an artery and killed him. And it probably would have killed him anyway, frankly, from the infection. But he, being the heir to the throne of England, they managed to get him the best help available. And the guy who operated on him left an account of what he did. And he doesn't say why he did what he did, but he does lay out what he did. And we read the account and realize he's talking about antiseptic surgery, which is a little odd. Like I say, it's 1403. Antiseptic surgery wasn't invented until about 1867. They didn't know what germs were until about the 1690s. And this is 1403. But obviously he was using germicidal material to wash the wound, wine and honey and turpentine. And then, having done that, he made what we would call a zero insertion force arrow extractor based on the screw mechanism. The guy was a goldsmith on top of everything else. So he knew how to make small, intricate metal devices, which he proceeded to do. And it's something that basically inserted the prongs inside the socket of the arrowhead, and then expanded them outward with a screw, so that they grasped the socket of the arrowhead from the inside. And then he was slowly able to extract it from the wound, which he then washed again with germicidal material, and slowly removed the packing from it till it closed after a number of days. Now, like I say, yes, that gives you. I hope no one's fainting out there while I'm describing this.
Well,
I'm glad I wasn't there, frankly.
Reading it is kind of like watching a Saw movie.
Yeah, right. And I mean, to be a surgeon back then, boy, I don't know what that took, man. But like I say, there's no mention of painkiller, but there must have been one. And he does pull it off, and we do have portraits of Prince Hal later as King Henry V, showing his left side, and there is no disfigurement, particularly. There's maybe a scar there, but no real disfigurement. So it did work. He did pull it off. Now, apparently what the guy was doing was based on empirical experience, basically, rather than scientific. in other words, based on hard knocks of the past and the space that got people killed, basically. Now, like the Romans, for instance, knew that if you put all your surgical tools in a brazier just for using it, like cooking them, like or pizza or something, you wouldn't have much post-operative infection. And he may have done that too. And the fact that he's using these germicidal materials to wash it must have been also based on empirical knowledge. But like I say, he never says why he does these things, but he did do them, and they're obviously antiseptic surgery.
Well,
it's just amazing, really.
Yeah, sounds like it. Also, before I forget, I want to mention to everybody that the call-in number is 832-632-7904. Feel free to call in, and I'll interrupt my guest here if he doesn't mind, and get you on the air. Also, to my knowledge, well, let me ask you right now, Lamont, do you have a website by any chance?
No, I just use the Amazon site for the book. It's Out of Place in Time and Space. Just go there and you'll see it. You can order it from there, or go to better bookstores, and if they don't have it, ask for it. Young people nowadays are far too polite. You need the practice of going in there and asking for something. It will be beneficial to you.
Also,
so, again, Out of Place in Time and Space.
I was also going to say y'all can get it at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And I have a link right here on my front page, at least for tonight, where you can click on it and go straight to Amazon and get it. And I'll be moving tonight's show and the link and the, book cover and all this here, everything to the archives tomorrow. And I'll also be copying a part of the show, not the book itself. YouTube won't let me, but it's the show anyway over at YouTube tomorrow as well, so that you people can hear it that aren't listening right now. Realize some people are going to be in the archives. Other people are listening on iTunes or listening on, Shoutcast or their iPhones or something, and aren't really at my site. Don't forget to tell everybody, though, the site here is www.paranormalpalace.com, and that membership here is free. If they want to sign up, they can get into the chat room and ask questions in chat. And, basically, be neighborly over here. Don't forget to also visit my friends over there at United Paranormal International. I like to kind of mention them every now and then because they mention me a lot over there at their site, so it's kind of a give and take for us. Now, also, we got Heidi in the chat room that suggested that you might want to get a Facebook page.
Facebook, that's an idea. I haven't really done Facebook. I've been involved with computers since 1982, believe it or not. Actually, before that, from 1979. And I don't see any romance in them. I'm sorry. So I just haven't been doing Facebook. Maybe I should do that, though, just as a marketing thing. You know what I mean? I built a computer with a soldering iron back in 77 to 79. I think it took a while. That was about the only way to get an affordable one when I got into it. And here I am with all this very fancy equipment around my desk, and I have never opened it. I don't know what it looks like inside. I'm not going to use soldering iron on them anymore.
Right. Well, I have a Facebook page for my show, and it does get some attention. So, I don't know if it matters really what we think about them or not, so much as it does what everybody else thinks, and so many other people seem to love using Facebook.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe I should do that. And I could link from there to Amazon.
Right. I think you can. You'd have to check with them and their rules to make sure. Now, another thing that you put in this book that really caught my attention was called the Apollo Script. Now,
oh, dear. You saw that.
Yeah, I did. Did I understand correctly, though, that somebody knew about the Apollo mission before the Apollo mission?
It gets weirder than that. We're talking about Jules Verne, who was fairly famous as a science fiction writer. And his science fiction novels often include technological predictions, most of which, however, were firmly based in technology that could be extrapolated from when he was alive in the 1880s when he was writing, latter half of the 1800s. things like fax machines and air conditioners and submarines, stuff like that. Fairly straightforward to predict from his time. But his first novel was written in 1865, and it just is not really that way. It described an American effort to send 3 men to the moon in an aluminum capsule launched from Florida. They circle the moon, they return to Earth, they land in the Pacific Ocean, and they're picked up by the U.S. Navy. Now, does any of that sound familiar?
I'd say quite a bit of it sounds familiar.
Yeah, right. It defies coincidence, and it goes beyond that. He, one part of the plot, he describes politicians from Texas making trouble with the project because they wanted to be included because they're as far south as Texas is. In reality, in the actual moon project, that did happen, and that's why Mission Control is located in Houston. Now, he also included in the novel a fairly detailed budget for the project, and modern analysis, including when you factor in inflation, shows that it's about 85% of what the moon program did cost at the time of the Apollo 8 mission, which he seems to be metaphorically describing. So maybe he didn't leave enough for managerial overhead or something, How does he get all this? How could he have foreseen this? I don't know. It's a mystery. I don't know if he could have told you how this all came to him. Now, of course, it's not entirely accurate. He has them using a gun. They're actually firing people out of a huge cannon, which, of course, wouldn't have worked. It had killed them, and it probably wouldn't have got out of the atmosphere, in fact. But a rocket probably would not have been acceptable to his readers. And because back then black powder rockets would have been considered weak and unreliable, which they were. But people understood cannons and how they worked. And he presented also as a one-shot deal rather than a slow development project, as it really was. But he also mentions like experimenting with animals, shooting animals out of small cannons to make sure it would work and stuff. A sort of lead up to the manned mission. So metaphorically, it's all there. They even try to put together a tracking network, but of course using telescopes. Now, of course, if he did have true foresight, or he'd have mentioned electronics and radar and all this other stuff that was actually used, and rockets. He didn't do that. It's firmly based in 1865 technology. But of course, it would be if he wanted people to read it. It's been my experience doing research for this book. If something is too far from the future, if it's too outside, people don't embrace it and say, "Oh, it's the future." Yeah, way. Yeah, they look at it and go, "Huh? What?" It's noise. And he avoided the noise. And he whatever if he was in tune to something from the future, he translated it into 1865 technology. And I congratulate him if that's what he did. Or if he made all this up, I congratulate him too. I don't know how he did that and got so close.
Very active imagination, maybe.
yeah, very active. And also, again, engineers can think along parallel lines, centuries apart. But these other details about the politics, the budget, having 3 men, the capsule made out of aluminum weighs about 10 tons, as did the Apollo capsule. So it just defies coincidence. Where did he get all this? And elsewhere throughout the book, like I said, I try to stick to Occam's razor and say, here's a simple explanation for all this. Here, I don't see a simple explanation. I can't help you on that one.
Right. Well, some things are kind of hard to fathom. Just thought I'd let you know that Heidi was just saying that if you had a Facebook page, she'd help you promote it with her network over there at Facebook.
Okay. I appreciate that, Heidi. She can send me an email later if she likes. I can give that to you before we leave, okay?
Or real quick,
you have my email address. Okay.
Right, I do have your email address. We've been in touch with each other about setting the show up. Also, I wanted to thank everybody for coming because I have a habit of sometimes getting it close to the end of the show and running out of time. I couldn't have a show without my listeners anymore, and I could have a show without the guests. We still got 15 minutes remaining, but I did want to make sure we got that in before I forgot to get it put in there. And also, I want to make sure before I get out of here to remind everybody to come back Saturday at 1. I'll be talking to Shelley Kaeher, Kaehr, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, about crystal skull consciousness and gemstones, and also reincarnation. So that should be another interesting show as well. I hope you don't mind. I'd like to remind everybody about the show that's coming up while they're here today so they don't forget.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that, if people wanted to get your book and look into it, this would make a great, if you ask me, in my opinion, conversation piece at dinner get-togethers or parties even, if you want to strike up a conversation. There are a lot of things in here that a lot of people don't know about. For example, there was the part about the pre-computer programmer in here.
Oh, yeah. That's, and we're talking about computer revolution here. Lady Ada Augusta Byron, Countess of Lovelace, she was involved with a guy named Babbage in putting together an attempt to build a mechanical computer in the 1830s and the 1840s. And what they were doing sounds just astonishingly modern. They were going to have something with an arithmetic unit, the central processor, and it would have read data and instructions from punched cards, as later IBM computers did. Punch cards are already in use then with fancy looms and stuff for controlling the weaving process. So they were going to use that. This had that idea just like IBM later did. The idea was to reliably produce error-free navigation tables and logarithm tables used for navigation, because navigation obviously was important to the British economy. They were a seafaring nation, and if you have navigation tables filled with errors, you're going to have navigation fraught with errors, and ships are going to run aground, and which actually did happen, as I understand. So the British government did back their project for a while, but it ran aground what we now call mission creep or creeping featureism or amateur project management, really. They kept having new ideas, so they'd stop and redesign the whole thing and then start over again, and consequently never got far with it. And finally, the British government lost patience and pulled their funding. The central processor part, what we call the arithmetic unit, they had detailed plans for that, a few test pieces, but detailed plans for the whole thing. And in the last 20 years or so, these blueprints have been used to actually build the thing. And it works great. Now the whole thing, the whole computer, probably would have been the size of a tennis court, and you'd probably need a steam engine to run it. It'd have been thousands of times slower than anything like any electronic computer we have nowadays. But based on what we've seen so far, the stuff we have built, it probably would have worked, and it probably would have produced reliable, complex calculations. So it's like these people out there, they can feel it out there. They have a hunger for it, and they're moving toward it. They can't really say what it is, but they're working on it. You know what I mean? Lady Byron, the Countess of Lovelace, she at one point wrote a scientific paper on computer science describing what this machine could do. It is the first scientific paper ever written on computer science, and in fact, the second one was written more than a century later. It's the only one for more than 100 years. And she's called the world's first programmer because this paper includes a detailed description of what the machine would have to do to solve a particular mathematical problem, laid out step by step by step, just like you would have to write a computer program. And in fact, it is so detailed you could immediately translate it to a real computer program. And in fact, that's been done. And in the process, they discovered she had a couple bugs in there. So the first computer bugs. But in the end, they did not manage to build it, and the whole thing is like an example of people whose reach exceeded their grasp or something. And now, in our present computer age, we kind it's kind of painful to read about them because we know what they were doing. We know exactly what they're doing. They may not have known what they were doing, but we know it. But now see it clearly, now that we're there. So it's these people pushing ahead to the dark, knowing it's out there.
And also, anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm drinking here.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that you also mentioned lasers in, what was it, 1360?
Oh, yeah, that is part of I have a whole chapter devoted to what appears to be depictions of flying saucers in medieval and Renaissance church art. And one of them, it looks like there's a flying saucer up there shooting a laser beam down at the Virgin Mary or something. But as I point out throughout this chapter, when we look at these things and we see a flying saucer up there in the sky in this church art, what we're doing is taking our visual vocabulary and imposing it on people who have their own visual vocabulary, a rather rich, extensive visual vocabulary that doesn't overlap ours, basically. And we see a disc-shaped thing in the sky, and we think, benign extraterrestrials have come down, golly. They saw a hole in the sky made by a vortex of angels that leads to the divine presence. And it shows up in pictures of like the Nativity, and like in one of them here, it's over the shoulder of the Virgin Mary, and you can see on the hill there's shepherds reacting to it. Actually, obviously, that's in the Bible story, of the Nativity. And the one with the laser beam, it's a good example of like visual vocabulary gone wild here, because it's done in, I think, 1486. It includes all these images that, frankly, are mystifying to us. The fact that there would be a hole in the sky and a laser beam coming down, least of it, you know what I mean? You have the Virgin Mary kneeling in a room, and on the wall outside the room, there's a peacock there. Why is that? What is that? And on the ground outside the window of a room, there's a cucumber and an apple. I guarantee nothing is in there by accident. Everything in there means something, has some meaning, because the artist wanted to get paid, you know what I mean? And some church official commissioned all this, and nothing is in there by accident. And the fact that it means something else to us just means we haven't gone to the library and researched the situation. But even that doesn't always help. And the picture you're looking at, it's the Annunciation, and the archangel is outside the Virgin Mary's window, while the laser beam with the Holy Spirit, because it's the Holy Spirit, there's a dove there,
right,
comes down on her, from the vortex of angels, because that's what it is. It's not a UFO. But anyway, the archangel is there, and over his shoulder, trying to get his attention, is the what do you call it? The saint that's in charge of that city. I forget what do you call it? And it's like he's trying to get the guy's attention, and he's imposing himself into the Annunciation. It's municipal boosterism. I hope you wouldn't get away with that nowadays. You know what I mean? I mean, it's blasphemy. So anyway, once you actually look at these pictures, it's entirely different, basically, and it doesn't get simpler. It actually gets more complicated in many cases. So, anyway.
Well, that's one of the things I also wanted to mention to everybody, is I know at least at the beginning of each chapter or of each story, each case you speak of, you've got a picture that's related to that will help them to identify with what you're describing.
Oh, yeah, that's the point, yeah. And like I say, it's written as a short standalone chapters. Each one's basically a magazine article. That's what I am by trade. I write for magazines most of the time. So each one of these is a standalone magazine article, and you can pick it up and read it and put it down. It's good for airport reading and airplanes. It's designed to be entertaining. It's worded to be entertaining. I tried to pack as much in there and be as entertaining as possible, and the feedback so far indicates it more or less succeeded. I think I may have confused a few people, but anyway, keep going.
I was going to say, I personally think you succeeded. I think it is very entertaining and very fascinating. Of course, I'm kind of a buff for, ancient technology that depicts a future type of mind anyway, because during my time on the internet, I am watching TV. I can't tell you how many of these cases I've found that, make me like, whoa, who would have ever thought, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Right. And admittedly, some of those cases are urban legends. Like I talk about the Dogon, the tribe in Mali in Africa, and the Star Sirius. And it turns out, well, it's a nice story, but you can't really believe it after a while when you really examine it. You're talking about this tribe in Africa, the deserts of Africa. Admittedly, they have clear nights there. Who are supposed to have figured out that Sirius is a double star. Okay, maybe so, but European astronomers didn't notice it was a double star until 1852, I think, and had to use one of the largest telescopes available at the time to discover that. And the two stars are so close together that you'd probably need eyeballs 6 inches diameter to distinguish them. And one's, hundreds of times brighter than the other. And so even with a telescope, usually you need special techniques to see the dimmer one. So and also you got to remember that members of that tribe have been serving in the French army since before World War I. So obviously there's been cross-cultural contamination. You just can't, so the fact that somebody went in there and interviewed someone who seemed to know about it, it doesn't mean that there's some ancient knowledge left over from the Egyptians that shows up here. I mean, it's an urban legend. Okay, that's one, but there are plenty of other examples that aren't urban legends, and I cannot explain them away. As I said, as with the Jules Verne and how he was so accurate. And there are others. Of course, probably my favorite, being a writer, would be the one about W.T. Stead. He was the British journalist who was there in the Victorian era. He was in on the founding of the tabloid genre. With the latest recent shutting of News of the World, he may be in on the end of that genre. But he was there when they discovered that sensationalism and pursuing causes and all that made money, and he was in on that. And in the 1880s and on, one of the causes he pursued was his annoyance at admiralty laws that did not require passenger liners to carry enough lifeboats for everyone. And he actually wrote evocative fiction, what would happen if there was a mid-ocean collision and the panic that would break out when people discovered there weren't enough lifeboats. And also, what would happen if there's separately in another story about what would happen if there's a mid-ocean collision with an iceberg, etc. And all this, at the end of all this, he got rich, basically. He founded his own magazine. He did real well. And at one point, he decided to attend a conference in the U.S. Having gotten rich, he, of course, got the best available accommodations for crossing the Atlantic, which happened to be on the Titanic. And you have to wonder what he was thinking there toward the end as the water was rising. Apparently, he did not count the lifeboats as he got aboard. And we don't know because he was one of the fatalities. So, this is another thing I kept coming across when I researched the book, is that you do run across people who had successful prophecies, accurate prophecies. Generally, it didn't help them. You think it would be surefire, foundation for a successful career or something, but no, it doesn't. Even if you don't make a big splash, you don't even follow it yourself many times. When people notice that you were correct, they usually just shrug and go on. No one makes a big deal out of it. It's as if we're programmed to ignore such things. And he ignored it with his own self. Went on there and went down with the Titanic. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but it is consistent. It does keep coming up.
Well, I can understand that. Well, listen, it's getting on toward 9 o'clock now. I was going to ask you, are you going to have any other books coming up or any events coming up, book signings or anything like that in the near future?
I will be doing a sequel to this, and I'm getting the list together now, but that won't be for a while. This book will be standing on its own for a while. So, like I say, great Christmas gift, guys. Then again, it's out of place in time and space, and I think you'll find it a fun read.
And do you have any last-minute thoughts for my listeners?
Just that Time is a mystery. We
Ain't
don't
that
understand
true?
it. Yeah, I think we're about as equipped to understand time as fish are equipped to understand water. You see the analogy? We're like swimming in it. We don't see it. And I don't know what we could do to see it. Really, we may not be equipped to do so.
Okay. Well, listen, it's been a pleasure having you on here. You've been every bit as interesting as your book is. I really enjoyed it.
Okay,
I was kind of hoping that you'd be willing to come back in the future.
well, okay. Eventually, yes, I would be willing to do that.
Okay, so maybe what we can do is when you get ready to run your sequel, we can come out here and we can talk about the sequel.
Okay, I'm game. I'm certainly game.
Okay, doke. Well, I tell you what, Lamont, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. And I think you got something going on, and I know it's time for me to start getting ready to get to bed since I need to get my son John up for school in the morning. So
Yes, that does happen. Yes.
we'll talk at you later. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me tonight is Lamont Wood, and we're going to be talking about artifacts that that have been found over time from history that appear, at least wise appear, to have been made centuries, maybe millennia ahead of their time, that looks like something closer to our point in time than they did the actual time they were made in. And he's wrote a book about this and, what his opinions and his takes on these are. And we're going to discuss that a little bit here in just a few minutes. Lamont, how are you doing tonight?
Pretty good. As you mentioned, the book is called Out of Place in Time and Space. You can get it on Amazon or in better bookstores for that matter. I think Barnes & Noble has it. I think even Walmart had it somewhere. So it's a collection of fairly short standalone chapters. It's good for airport reading. I think there's about 40 or 42 examples. You'd think I'd know the exact number, wouldn't you? Of things that, that satisfy the title, Out of Place in Time and Space. When I approached this, I was looking for sort of a high concept for all these examples to fit into. And I came up with the idea of the reverse anachronism. A standard anachronism is when you go to the movies, and the movie's about Rome, and the actors are speaking English. Okay, they ought to be speaking Latin, but you accept that, you don't know Latin. But that's an anachronism. That's something portrayed out of place in time. So I came up with the definition of reverse anachronism. That is where you look into the past and you see something there that really belongs in the present. And if such things exist, logic would demand that there are things in the present that are from the future that probably we don't understand and dismiss as noise or misunderstand or something. And oddly enough, I come up, and as soon as I started looking for these things, I began finding examples. And probably the most blatant one is the one I lead off with in Chapter 1, the so-called Virgin and Childless Toy Helicopter. That's a fairly conventional church painting from the late Middle Ages. It's been hanging in a museum in France now for probably centuries. And shows, like I said, the Christ child sitting in the lap of the Virgin Mary. And probably no one paid much attention to what the Christ child is depicted as doing until the last few decades, when it kind of leaps out at us, because we recognize it now as being part of our daily lives. The Christ child is depicted as playing with a pull-string flying toy helicopter. Now, that's pretty weird considering that it was painted in 1460. Another...
And that picture is pretty clear. I saw it in your book, and it wasn't shaped exactly like a helicopter. It was like a round ball with a propeller on top, but the principle is there. Is the main thing.
It's a little toy flying machine, basically. And serious attempts by serious scientists to build such a thing didn't begin to another 4 centuries. Yet children have been doing it apparently for who knows how long, as it turns out. And that's a theme I keep running across when I was doing research for this book, is that children's toys can often embody advanced technology, but no one pays any attention to them. They're considered frivolous no matter what. Because I also discovered that the Greeks and Romans had steam-powered toys, for instance, although they seem to have made no attempt to do serious work with them. Although they could have scaled it up, put a kind of belt on it and turned a pump or something, but there's no record of them ever doing that. And of course, we've all heard of these toys found in Central American tombs, wheels on them, wheeled toys, from cultures that did not themselves use wheeled transport. Although that's probably because they didn't have decent roads and draft animals, so it wouldn't have been very helpful. But what are the kids doing nowadays? What should we be paying attention to? And I look around and think, does anyone really understand how bicycles work? But anyway. So it is something to think about.
Well, yeah. And, when I was a kid, I had a little toy, a plastic toy, that a round propeller, kind of like the propeller on the picture you're talking about, went down on it, and when you pushed it up, it spun, and it would, when it left the stick, it would take off and fly. And it's sort of like a more, I guess you could say, modern day version of what you were describing.
Right. There's from 1460, absolutely. Now, the thing about this, presumably the artist included it in the picture for two reasons. One, to show that this is a child being portrayed, because of artistic conventions of the time, that children were just scale model adults. And two, he wanted to include some kind of crucifix theme. And the four blades of the little toy helicopter makes the crucifix. But, this indicates that he assumed that people looking at it in 1460 were familiar with this and know it was a toy. I assume it basically it's a powered whirligig, really. Whirligig was just a spinning thing on a stick, and you can wave it and make it turn, or the wind will hit it and make it turn. Well, put a little English on it, apply a little, energy to it, and it'll fly by itself. You don't have to wave it in the air, and it would be entertaining small boys. But apparently no one studied this phenomenon for several hundred years.
Makes you wonder why they didn't.
Yeah, I know. Another good example of the idea of reverse anachronism would be the illustrated book that surfaced in, I think, 1912. It's since been dated to 1420, which is, of course, before the invention of the printing press. So, of course, it's hand-lettered and hand-illustrated. It's written out in handwriting by someone who appears to have been comfortable doing it. It's written with ease. In a alphabetic language. The language can be analyzed, and we can identify rules. The text can be mathematically analyzed, and we, in a way that we know it follows the patterns you expect in a language, and it's not gibberish. It's not just letter salad, word salad, whatever. The problem is this alphabet appears nowhere else on Earth. The rules of the language that they have identified as rules of no known language. And the mathematical patterns that they can pull out of it are those of no known language either. Usually you can identify, at least identify the language by the alphabet patterns. And that has gotten us nowhere, this thing. Some of the leading lights in the field of cryptography have examined it and haven't come up with any convincing decryptions. Which is really odd.
Yeah.
And then there's the illustrations, which appear to be about something until you really look at them, and then you realize they're not really about anything. There's like depictions of plants that they don't match any botanical information. There's what appears to be sketches of star fields, or that don't match anything from astronomy, or maybe they're microorganisms or random doodlings. We don't know. Now, there are words that appear in some parts of the book and not in others, as if they belong to the vocabulary of the subject of that chapter. And the whole thing is laid out and organized as if it's a book that you're so-called Antikythera mechanism, because it started out as a reverse anachronism from the future when it was found 100 years ago, but now we see it's something from our present. Let me explain. It was found on the seabed off the Greek island of Antikythera, hence the name, in 1901. And at the time, they dismissed it as some kind of broken clockwork mystery thing, the jumble of corroded bronze gears, basically. Nowadays, we see it for what it must have been, because it's sort of come into sync with our times. It was an ancient Roman computer, not a computer in a sense of a binary mechanism that you can program, but in a sense of the programming built into the design. It was a geared assembly, a machine for reconciling the solar and the lunar calendar. I did a bunch of other things too, but that was the main purpose. We still do that. We figure, what date Easter is going to be on by the lunar calendar. But then when you ask, when's Easter going to be, they tell you, using solar calendar, April so-and-so. So it still applies, and you might still find some use for it. But again, it started out as a reverse anachronism from the future. No one understood it. And now it's kind of slipped into the present. We see it for what it is. And you're probably waiting for me to come up with examples of reverse anachronisms from the future that are hanging around nowadays, staring at us, and we don't see them.
I think you covered some of those in the book, didn't you?
Well, I have one real candidate for it, for that. Other than that, I'm not sure we're on solid footing because I'm saying if we saw them, we probably would mistake them for something else.
Right.
Yeah. Or
Which
just not
that's pretty
understand.
common.
Yeah, that is common. We could be surrounded by these things. But my favorite example, my personal candidate for such a thing, would be the so-called Voynich manuscript. That is a hand-lettered,